The fog was still dragging its hem along Harborford Bay when I set the table in my old Queen Anne on Garrick Street. I had rubbed a chicken with lemon and thyme the night before and left it to marinate in the blue enamel pan that had belonged to my grandmother. Sourdough from the co-op leaned against a cutting board. A jar of pickled carrots caught the light, and 3 roses from the narrow strip of garden out front, just enough to make the room look as if it had remembered something kind. Sundays were my ritual, whether the week had bruised me or not. Today, I wanted my daughter, her husband, and his parents to feel welcome. Often lately, I felt like a guest in my own house, and I set the table as if hospitality could talk the rooms into choosing me. We were halfway through the meal when it tilted. Ruth Harrow, my son-in-law's mother, dabbed the corner of her mouth and asked Nora, my Nora, if she would still be available to help with a Redfield charity gala the following weekend. I reminded her gently that Nora and I had planned a paper marbling and binding workshop at my studio. We had booked the date months ago, and I had already prepped the alum baths and cut boards for beginner covers. The table quieted. Nora lifted her eyes to mine, then set her fork down with a click that sounded larger than it was. I take direction from the Harrows now, she said, each word neat, polished, certain. Caleb, her husband, looked into his water glass. Lionel Harrow reached for the salt and passed it to no one in particular, like a man placing a prop back where it belonged. My house, my food a plate. I had warmed in the oven so it would not leach the heat from the chicken, and I had been dismissed in a sentence you could copy cleanly into a ledger. A dozen responses crossed my mind at once. I might have asked who precisely paid the mortgage drafted from my account every month, or who sat in a dim Newman Street rehearsal space winter after winter while Nora learned to sight read and I learned to pretend my hands were not cracked from glue. Instead, I folded my napkin and laid it to the left of my plate, the way my mother taught me when I was a girl in a ranch house 3 counties inland. Conversation resumed as if a narrow bridge had held. The highway south the way fog can flatten a driver's sense of distance, the Redfield event schedule, what Ruth called proper decor for a foyer, mirror, umbrella stand, neutral runner. I found myself speaking only when strictly required. Even the clatter of cutlery seemed to consult them before deciding where to fall. When they stepped out onto the porch, at last, polite thanks, lingering scent of cologne, the front door closed with a soft finality that did not belong to weather. I stood for a moment in the hall, listening to the house decide what the afternoon would be without them. In the kitchen, I gathered plates in a careful stack and let the warm water run. Nora's sentence, I take direction from the Harrows, now bounced off the tile and came back sharper, the way certain notes do in a room that knows them. To keep from shattering along that pitch, I let my mind slip backward to a season I have kept mostly closed to other people. 26 winters ago, a weather service warning had skirted the coast for days. The radio murmured about a rogue swell from somewhere far out, a low, invisible engine. The call came at dusk. A small boat hadn't returned from the line off Drum Point. The Coast Guard did not promise anything, not hope, not certainty, only that they were looking. I made tea and watched the clock move wrong. By midnight, the water had made its decision. I walked out to the bluff, the wind aching through my coat, and squeezed my hands together to keep from losing their shape. I told myself out loud that Nora would not feel empty the way a house feels empty when the person who laughed in it is no longer there. She would not grow up counting quarters for gas or turning off the porch light to save the bulb. I had a trade book repair conservation, the patient work of putting something back into a binding that time or damp had lifted out. The county archive in the old depot with its high windows sent me ledgers swollen with water probate files, with their envelopes frilled to lace atlases whose spines had split so wide they could no longer keep their own land together. At night, after Nora slept, I stitched. Kettle on lamp angled just so, bone folder warm in my hand. I skipped dinner more times than I admitted to anyone. Mortgage due on the 1st. Insurance swallowed part of the 3rd week. An adjustable rate behaved like a small stone in a shoe I couldn't remove. There were years when the house and I learned each other the way 2 wary creatures do. The boiler liked to be told twice. The front steps swelled if I did not paint them by June. I loved the way the front parlor took light, and the old fir wainscoting kept its own weather. When Nora was 12, she danced in a recital at the Civic Hall. Afterward, we ate grilled cheese on the hood of the car because it felt like a celebration anyway. None of that is dramatic, and it does not need to be. It is a life. I stitched and I saved, and the house stayed ours because I made sure it did. That was my measure of adulthood once you kept the roof over the 2 of you, and you did not complain in a register that made other people turn away. So when Ruth's opinions began to colonize small corners of my kitchen, I told myself I could tolerate any amount of seasoning. Once she opened my pantry and smiled as if she were tasting an idea. "Dry goods are calmer in glass, Evelyn," she said, by height left to right. The next week, Nora lined my jars as if they had enrolled in school. "This is the way Mom and Dad do it," she said, meaning Ruth and Lionel with the thoughtlessness of someone who has not yet hurt herself. When I folded the patchwork quilts my aunt had pieced in '74, Lionel chuckled. "Charming in a cabin," he said. "In a city, you want fewer stories on display." Caleb's silence helped itself to the biggest chair in the room. If I asked what he thought, he said, "Not worth fighting about, as if fights happen only when you name them. The practical things followed the way rain finds the easiest downward path." A notice from the water company arrived with my name printed clearly across it, and Nora scanned it to Ruth for tracking. She called it efficiency, a word that behaved like a white glove. Streaming accounts, phone lines, the sort of utilities that hang like invisible wires through a household, all of it began to route through the Harrow's habits. My signature became a formality that did not require my opinion to exist. I still paid and they still adjusted, and each adjustment asked only for my good nature. If you had asked me then why I did not object, I would have said I was being strategic, that daughters do not come closer when you push. I had believed for so long that patience was a currency that could buy loyalty that I began to spend it reflexively, the way a person tips out of custom rather than thanks. But patience is not a contract. It is only time passing in one direction. The more of it I paid, the more invisible I became in the ledger of our days. A faint pencil line erased each time a firmer hand copied the page. On the first Friday of the month, Old Ferry Street glowed the way it does when the live bands tune and the kettle corn begins to lift its perfume above the alleyways. I set a small table by the museum steps with 3 restored ledgers, 2 sample bindings, and a hand-inked sign, Heart Bindery and Repair. I smiled until my face ached and answered the same questions about glue and thread until the answers felt like the weather forecasts necessary. Unsurprising. When Nora arrived with the Harrows, a little proud sound rose in me against my will. She ran a finger along the raised bands of a calf binding the way she used to as a child. "Charming," Ruth said, smiling in a way that included me and made me smaller at once. But of course, Nora's center of gravity is in Redfield these days. People drifted kinder than they needed to be. I straightened a stack of pamphlets and told my hands they were steady. By the time I was back in my kitchen that evening, the house felt alert, as if it had taken in all that had occurred outside its walls and was waiting to see what I would call it. I washed the last plate by hand, listening to the click of its rim against the sink, and dried it with the flour sack towel I reached for without looking. I thought of the promises I made to myself on that winter bluff years ago. I thought of how long a person can live by the idea that endurance itself teaches respect. The roses on the table had begun to open each petal, letting go of the one that kept it closed. I stood there for a while, and the kitchen stood with me, and I understood that the quiet I had practiced so carefully had taught everyone in my life something other than respect. It had taught them I could be edited out. That recognition did not knock anything over. It did not throw open a door. It sat down in the chair under the window, crossed its legs, and looked at me the way a good book does, when it knows you are ready to read the paragraph you have avoided. The night gathered along the street, soft as felt. A gull called somewhere toward the bay, and the sound traveled the way old memories do, straight through walls that remember the shape of loss. I turned off the light. The rooms breathed. The house held its own weather. I set my hand flat on the table to feel the grain and stood still until I could hear the clock in the front hall decide the second it wanted next. By the time the first Friday rolled around, the city had arranged itself into the version of itself I love most. Strings of lights hung between second-story windows, a guitar warming its way into tune somewhere near the museum steps, the sweet salt smell of kettle corn rising to meet the marine air. I carried 2 collapsible trestles, a canvas cloth, a hand-lettered sign, Heart Bindery and Repair, and the kind of stubborn hope that makes you iron a table cover even when you know it will wrinkle the moment you clip it into place. The museum's sandstone frontage kept the late sun on its shoulder. I set 3 restored ledgers side by side, a shipping register with scuffed calf boards and fresh cords invisible under the paper, an early property book whose leaves had been washed and resized, now lying flat like a sigh, and a humble minute book with a new spine dyed the red of a library chair. A retired teacher touched the raised bands with a reverence that made me want to polish them a second time. A boy asked if the thread was real, and I lifted the book so he could see the kettle stitch answer for itself. When people asked what I used for adhesive, I explained that wheat starch paste is just patience turned into glue. I had promised myself nothing beyond showing up. Still, when I saw Nora moving through the crowd with Ruth and Lionel, a reflex lit inside me, the way a pilot light holds its small flame no matter the draft. Caleb followed a step behind, hands in his jacket pockets, eyes on the pavement as if reading for errors. Nora reached the table and ran one fingertip along the new spine of the property book, a tiny gesture that loosened something old and good in my chest. She used to do that at 5, touch the books I'd mended, say, "Better now," and declare the operation a success. "Charming work," Ruth said brightly as if speaking into a microphone. "It takes such patience." She set her purse on the corner of my table so the strap pressed the cloth into a new diagonal. Of course, she added, smile widening. Nora's center of gravity is Redfield these days. The Harrow house runs a bit differently. I heard 2 conversations around me. One, the words in the open air, the other, the glances. People pretended not to trade when a parent is nested inside another parent's sentence. Lionel nodded, a small magistrate approving a claim. Caleb examined a crack in the sidewalk with theatrical focus. The roasted sugar smell thickened. A brass trio started all of me a little too slowly. I straightened my pamphlets and asked my hands to behave. Nora's face held a practiced calm that would photograph well. "We're helping with the gala program," she said almost softly. I said yes. I know, I said, matching her tone. "You and I had penciled the workshop, that's all." The phrase sounded like I was the one asking permission. I disliked it even as I heard it. Ruth's gaze slipped into my open crate of supplies, bone folder, book weights, small tin of paste, cataloging without curiosity. "Order is such a comfort," she said, not quite to me. "I keep telling Nora a place for everything, everything in its place." She rested a hand on my sign, flattening a ripple that did not need flattening. People drifted on kind in the way strangers are when they've seen something you will not name. Before leaving, Ruth squeezed Nora's shoulder like a seal of office. Lionel gave Caleb a look that suggested a task had been completed to specification. When they blended into the street, the tablecloth sagged where Ruth's purse had lived briefly. I pulled it straight, then let it wrinkle. It felt correct that the cloth refused a command it could not hear. When I got home, the house carried with it a thin echo of street music, a leftover measure that had slipped under my coat. I washed the smell of kettle corn from my hands and made tea I did not drink. The roses I'd cut were opening past their best, still beautiful, but already on their way to something else. I stood very still, the way you do when you finally admit that the tilt you felt earlier is real and not just weather in your head. 2 mornings later, after a solid run of rain, I returned from the depot archive with a wrapped parcel in a careful mood. The side door to my studio at the back of the house stood neither open nor latched, one of those careless positions that doorways take when someone assumes a space exists only to be entered. I set my parcel on the hall chair and listened. The studio was empty, but it had not been empty long. The air held a trace of perfume and the chirp of a phone shutting down after use. Everything looked almost in place. Almost. The wooden weight that lived 2 inches to the left of the press was 3 inches to the right. The brush and the tin cups slanted like it had been scolded. On the work table lay an 1893 Port Register buckram boards, softened by age paper, a pale cream with iron gall ink, walking across it in a square, tidy hand. One corner of the upper board was dark and damp. Coffee by the smell, a careless, recent spill, the ring tightening itself as if it could grow out of the page and stand on the table as a small, furious moon. I breathed in and tried to breathe out in the same key. The blot had spread into the first 2 leaves. Ink had bled to a gray I recognized from too many wet files. I put a blotter down too late to save what the paper had already learned. A thumbprint lived at the edge of the stain, half crescent, elegant in its way, proof that a finger had tested the damage. Keys bumped the exterior lock with the cheerful entitlement of someone rattling the right door. Caleb stepped in first, then Ruth, then Nora, talking over one another about seating charts and budget lines until they saw me and remembered the look that says you have interrupted a person in the middle of their life. "We needed Pierre," Ruthie said, switching to a tone reserved for justifying the use of things. "Your space is so convenient, we could hear ourselves think." She glanced at the register, then at my face, then at the register again, as if the book were a child who had failed to remain unspilled. "That's county property," I said, calm in the way of a patient needle. "On loan to me, catalogued, signed for. If it goes back damaged, my name bears the damage." Caleb lifted the spare key I'd given him weeks ago when he'd said he needed to run in one afternoon for a phone charger. He jingled at once, a bright little shrug. "I thought it would be fine," he said, and somehow made the sentence sound like it belonged to someone else. Nora's jaw tightened the way mine does when I balance a heavy book with one hand and find that I've misjudged the weight. "We cleaned up," she said. "It's only a corner." She reached for a paper towel that did not exist and then put her hand down as if remembering that sometimes intention is exactly nothing. Ruth moved forward with a scarf already in her hand, the silk ready to be sacrificed to the problem she had helped to create. Here she set and touched the darkened board lightly, the way you pat flour off a sleeve. "No," I said, and my voice surprised me. Not loud, not sharp, but with the unmistakable density of a thing that is not going to move. Lionel was not there, and yet his absence felt like a word that had been left out on purpose. Ruth recoiled a fraction and then smiled, the graceful retreat of a dancer, leaving a stage she prefers to own. "Of course," she murmured. Nora did not step closer. She looked past me at the press at the neat rows of pasteboard at the weights aligned like punctuation down the shelf. I could see her trying to occupy the old map of this room, the one she used when she was small, and it was enough to be where I was. Then she cleared her throat and said, "Mother, I take direction from the Harrows now." The sentence landed with the crispness of typed minutes, a line you could trace back to its author with your eyes closed. Caleb pocketed the key, forgetting or choosing not to remember that I was watching his hand. Ruth gathered her papers. Nora watched me the way a person watches a window they are not sure will open. "We'll be out of your way," Ruth said, and had the grace not to add for now. When the door shut, the room reclaimed its own temperature as if relief had a measurable degree. I sat on the stool at the end of the table and looked at the stain until it stopped being a stain and became simply what it was, a change that would always be visible even after I did everything I could do. I lifted the register and slid a sheet of Hollytex beneath the first leaf, built a small fence of blotters around the damage, and weighted the corner with a glass snake I keep for this purpose. The snake is not necessary. It is a superstition that belongs to my hands. Stay, I told the page, and meant other things as well. Late afternoon laid pale light across the floorboards. The house, never loud, pressed its silence into a different shape, not the woolen quiet of habit, but the clear quiet of a note held exactly to pitch. I could hear the drip of the downspout outside. A neighbor's screen door thudded and thudded again. Somewhere a dog objected to a squirrel's existence in an oak. I thought about the fare and the purse strap pressing the tablecloth into obedience. I thought about the pantry jars marching tall to short like soldiers, ready for inspection. I thought of Caleb's key singing as it entered the careless music of borrowed authority. I let myself think all the way through. The thinking did not shatter anything. It reassembled a spine I had worn thin, treating other people's pages as if they were my own. I washed my hands and watched the thin gray water whirl away like unease choosing a drain. When I came back to the table, the glass snake looked foolish and correct. The damp had spread as far as it intended to spread. I wrote a brief note on a square of paper and slid it under the weight. Coffee spill on arrival. Stabilized. Drying under restraint. As I labeled, a shadow moved in the doorway. "You looked busy, Tamsin," Roe said, stepping inside with the caution of a neighbor who has known you long enough to understand the many versions of busy. Tamsin lives 2 houses down. She is the sort of person who can hold silence without turning it into a problem. "You missed the excitement," I said. "I saw 3 Harrows go out your side gate," she said, and set a paper-wrapped load of ginger cookies on the stool by the wall. "And I heard a tone in your no that I haven't heard in a while." I smiled without opening it. Tamsin's quiet is not empty. It is a place to set something down. "They use the studio," I said. "They left me a lesson in evaporation." She stepped close enough to take in the register, the haloing stain, the small battlement of blotters. "You'll mend it," she said, not as comfort, more as recognition. "I will," I said. The words felt like walking barefoot on old wood you trust. She looked at me the way you check a book's spine to be sure the signatures are still where the binder meant them to be. "And you?" she asked. I could have answered in any number of ways that would have dressed the truth to make it agreeable. I did not. "I've been waiting in a room I own," I said, telling myself that waiting is a form of care. It isn't. Tamsin nodded once, the exact size of the acknowledgement I could stand. "I'll be in my garden if you need a witness," she said, and left the cookies where she had put them, the way offerings should be left without instruction. When evening came, the kitchen window showed me my own face, against a wash of blue sky. The roses on the table were fully open now, a little wild around the edges, as if they'd taken off their coats after a long day. I poured a glass of water and drank it like a person who had forgotten how good water is when it is simply water and not prelude. I went back to the studio and checked the register. The page had settled into the blotter's patience. The stain had darkened to the color of tea left too long, but its edges were no longer traveling. I adjusted the weight and smoothed the leaf with my fingertips, as gently as you touch someone's hair away from their face when they are asleep. The house exhaled that slow breath old houses take when the temperature shifts a little, and their wood remembers to expand or to rest. I stood between the table and the door and let the breath move through me. There are moments when the outline of your life stops ghosting and clicks into focus. No clarion, no crash. Only the exact shape of the thing you had not said, learning your name from the inside out. I flipped the studio light, closed the door with the soft insistence it prefers, and stood a long while in the hall. The banister's varnish had worn thin, where years of hands, mine, Nora's, even Caleb's once, when he first came to supper, had polished it without meaning to. I could feel the warm dent of palm leaves in wood, when it takes for granted there will be a next time. In the front room, a small stack of business cards lived inside the top drawer of the desk I'd bought secondhand the year Nora turned 10. The drawer stuck a little as always, then yielded with a sigh. I laid my hand on the cards without moving them. The room around me held its pitch. Silence had kept me company for years. That night, it took a different seat, not at my side, but opposite me, looking straight on. I didn't ask it for advice, and it didn't offer any. We understood each other well enough to know what we were no longer. By morning, the quiet in the house had settled into a clarity I could stand in. I brewed coffee, drank half of it, poured the rest down the sink, and gathered what a life looks like on paper: the deed, the mortgage statements, the utility bills with my name repeating their chant along the top line. I slid them into a manila folder and tucked the folder under my arm the way I carry a large book when it matters I not drop it. Avery Leland's office sits above a bakery on Fenton Street, 2 blocks from the square where the weekend market huddles when the wind comes inland. The stairwell smelled like yeast and sugar and a little like old varnish. The receptionist took my name with a pencil, wrote it in a neat hand, and waved me toward a chair that had seen better cloth. When Avery came out, he was younger than I expected and exactly steady enough. He shook my hand without trying to own it. We sat across a desk that had nothing on it except a blotter, a brass pen, and a cup of pencils sharpened to identical points. I laid out my folder like a person showing a map of a place she has walked every day and is now willing to name. Avery read the deed slowly, then the mortgage statement, then the water bill. He did not hurry, and he did not make conversation to comfort either of us. "You are the sole owner," he said, finally tapping the deed once with the back of his pen as if to invite the document to agree. "There are no co-signers. There is no tenancy agreement with anyone else. Anyone who stays in the home does so because you allow it. That permission is yours to grant and yours to withdraw." I nodded, and it felt like lifting a weight I had not admitted I was holding. He went on, plain and clean. "Phone lines, internet streaming accounts. If those are in your name and you pay for them, you can remove other users or close the accounts. Keys. You can change the cylinders. If there are personal belongings that are not yours, you inventory them. Photograph them, store them in good faith, and make clear when and how they can be collected. Avoid confrontation. Give written notice of the terms. Keep a record of everything." I heard his voice and also heard the house listening, as if it were relieved to be treated as a noun again and not a suggestion. "It feels," I began, then stopped. The word cruel had waited behind my teeth, but it did not fit. "It feels like ending something I spent years making generous." Avery considered me in the ordinary way people do when they are paying attention and not trying to be impressive. "Ownership and burden prefer to walk together," he said. "If one is declined, the other doesn't have a path." He slid a legal pad toward me. "You don't need a speech, you need facts with dates." I left with my folder heavier for having been believed by ink. The bakery sent me back down the stairs holding a paper bag with 2 rolls I had not intended to buy. Outside, the day was blunt with wind and bright with the kind of cold that keeps its promises. I pressed the bag to my chest until the heat of it became mine. At home, I set the folder on the kitchen table and opened a fresh notebook. I picked a page and wrote the date at the top. Then I walked the house room by room with the notebook and my phone, which I used like a witness who writes in light. In the front room, 2 quilts folded in the cedar chest, Nora's. On the mantel, a framed photo of her at 12, borrowed years ago and never returned to the album. On the hall table, a spare set of keys on a ring engraved C and N. In the upstairs bath, her skin cream with the lid never screwed on properly. In the guest room, Caleb's overnight bag, the zipper open to show 3 pairs of socks, as if an argument had been searched and then left where it was. For each thing I wrote a line. For each drawer I took a picture. When the pages filled and the notebook grew heavy in my hand, I called Tamsin. She came with the quiet, practical air of someone who once managed a library and still thinks in card catalogs. "You're doing this," she said, not as a question. She took the notebook, read the first page, and nodded as if the order satisfied her. We packed. We unfolded flattened boxes and taped them square. We put Nora's wool sweaters between tissue the way you pack a season you can't wear anymore. I wrote names across the flaps in black marker: Nora H. and Caleb, not Harrow's, and not us. A choice I felt in the bones of my hand. Tamsin labeled a second line with the room the items had come from. I slipped a copy of the photo under the tape after sealing each box a picture outside to match what was inside. When the front room had become a small city of labeled cardboard, I made tea and forgot to drink it. Tamsin stood at the window a moment and then turned back to me. "Do you want me to stay?" she asked. "I want you to have a key," I said. We walked to Barlow's locksmith on Hallowell, where a bell on the door announced our arrival with a thin clang like an old bicycle. Mr. Barlow examined the cylinders I'd brought in a cloth bag and agreed to come by at 4. He's one of those craftsmen who speak directly to the task at hand and leave the rest alone, and I was grateful for it. At 4:10, he replaced the front and back locks, then the studio door, then the deadbolt. I have never trusted. He stepped back, wiped his hands, and placed 3 keys on the table. New brass edges, crisp. I pressed one into Tamsin's palm, felt her hand close around it, and put the others on a ring that already knew the weight of my house. Back at the kitchen table, I opened my notebook again. I wrote a letter. I didn't write it to convince anyone of anything. I wrote it to say what was true and just enough to be understood. Nora and Caleb's personal items are boxed and labeled in the front room. Access to the house is now by appointment. Collection tonight is available at 7 o'clock. The studio is no longer available as a meeting space. Utilities and services in my name will no longer include lines for you. If you choose to align your decisions with the Harrow household, I accept that, and I release the responsibilities that came with my permission here. This is my home. Respect for it, and for me, is the condition of any future presence within it. E. Hart. I read it twice, fixed a comma that had strayed, and sent it in an email to both of them. The faint sound the outbox makes when it lets a message go is its own kind of door. I closed the laptop and set it aside. Evening had begun to gather on Garrick Street, a slow stacking of blue. At 6:40, I moved the boxes onto the porch and stacked them in 2 clean columns that would fit a trunk. The fog from the bay had crept in low and settled along the street in a way that made car lights look like they were thinking. I stood inside the front door with the porch light on. The key ring lay cool in my pocket. Tamsin sat on the bench in her yard across the way, pruning shears idle in her lap, not watching me, and not watching. Headlights turned this corner at 6:58. The sedan rolled to a stop with the care of a person parking next to someone else's memory. Caleb got out first, then Ruth, then Lionel. Nora came last and stood where the sidewalk cracks into 3 pieces before the steps begin. Caleb looked at the new lock as if it had said his name wrong. "You changed it," he said. "I did," I said. My voice felt like a tool I had finally found in the drawer where it belonged. Ruth's laugh had edges. "You're putting your own daughter out on the porch, Evelyn. To impress whom?" "No one," I said. "Collect what is yours. The appointment is for 7. Lionel moved a fraction forward posture, composed like an old verdict. "This is rash," he said. "Families don't flourish under ultimatums." "Families don't flourish under erasure either," I said. "This roof is mine. The way in is respect. It has not been used." Ruth opened her mouth, closed it, then tried a different shape. "We meant to help," she said softly, trying a key she did not have. "Nora needs structure." "Then you can provide it," I said. I stepped back so the door remained between us without slamming it in anyone's face. The fog gathered around our ankles and made everything sound closer to the bones than it would have sounded on a dry night. Caleb gave the smallest shrug a body can give and still call it motion. He bent and lifted the first box, his forearms tightening as if the cardboard had ideas of its own. Lionel followed his lead with a thinner willingness. Ruth hovered as if indignation might be useful furniture and she was deciding where to put it. Nora did not move. She watched the boxes, then the door, then my hand near my pocket. In the amber light, her face looked younger and older at once, the way faces do when they are choosing whether to say something that might change what a house is. I did not fill the space for her. I did not leave it either. I looked back. Caleb loaded the trunk. The first thud of cardboard touching carpet inside the car landed with a hollow sound that made Tamsin shift slightly on her bench. Ruth gave orders under her breath that no one answered. Lionel lifted a second box with the care of a man handling evidence that he does not wish to implicate him. The porch boards took their weight and were kind enough not to complain. Ruth tried again. "You'll regret this," she said so softly the sentence almost apologized for itself. "I already regret too much," I said, and realized I was telling the truth without trying to be brave. Caleb closed the trunk when they'd filled it. The sound traveled down the street and came back. He waited for Nora to decide. She didn't move. She looked at me, and then at the keyhole she could no longer claim with a piece of metal. When she spoke, the words were smaller than the ones she had used at my table and more exact. "Do you really want me to go? I want my house to be mine," I said. "You are welcome in it when that is welcome to you." She nodded once, small, solemn, then chose stillness. Caleb called her name not loudly. Lionel opened the passenger door for Ruth with the rituals of a world he liked to pretend had not ended. Nora turned, got into the back seat, and folded her hands in her lap as if to keep from breaking anything else. The car moved off taillights, thinning to a red line and then to nothing. The fog kept their place for a while as if the night wanted to see if they would return. I closed the door and let the house receive its sound. The latch settled into its new metal with a satisfied click I felt in my teeth. I leaned my back against the wood and stayed that way until my knees remembered I had asked a great deal of them. The hall smelled like a collision of things that don't happen at the same time. Cardboard rose petals, weeks-old lemon oil from the banister, a draft from the studio door that had learned new weather. The front room held its city of boxes' shadows even after the boxes had gone. The space looked like it had been freshly erased, the way a chalkboard looks right after a careful hand has wiped it clean in mist on purpose, a few faint equations near the edge to prove that learning had occurred. I turned off the porch light and left the inside lights low the way I do when I'm working late and want the house to know I have not abandoned it to itself. In the kitchen I stood with both hands flat on the table. I breathed in, I breathed out. The breath had the taste of rain that hasn't fallen yet. The clock in the front hall decided each second without hurrying. The new keys, still not warm, lay on the counter in a small spill like coins from a country that hasn't been on a map in a long time. I went to the studio. The register from 1893 waited under the glass snake and the little battlement of blotters. The stain had darkened and stopped traveling. I lifted the weight, eased, the page touched the edge with the pad of my finger. I could feel where the paper had stiffened around what it had learned. I wrote another line on the square I'd left beneath the weight edges fixed. Drying continues. Return to board tomorrow. Back in the kitchen, I rinsed a cup I hadn't used, then dried it and put it back where it belongs. The house responded in its native language of small expansions and relaxations. A floorboard adjusted. The old radiator in the hall ticked twice as if thinking a thought it didn't need to say aloud. Outside, a gull cried somewhere toward the water and then decided against a second sentence. I took the letter I had printed and folded a copy for the folder with the deed. The pen left a faint ridge where I pressed harder than I meant to at my name. On the envelope, I wrote the date again, then slid the paper inside. I put the folder back on the shelf above the desk, next to the box of photographs I keep meaning to sort and never do. The banister's varnish caught the light as I went upstairs. My hand found the worn place without looking. In the mirror at the landing, I saw a woman with hair pinned up the way she's always pinned it when she needs her hands free. Her face held the exact measure of what the evening had been, not triumph, not sorrow, something solid that could be set down and picked up again without falling apart in the middle. I turned off the hall light and the house changed key with me. The rooms arranged themselves into their night selves. The studio breathed behind its door, steady and working. I lay down and listened to my body recognize a bed that had not moved an inch and yet felt briefly like a new address. The window ticked as the temperature dropped and remembered it was glass. When sleep came, it did not argue. It had, after all, been invited by a door that closed and meant it. Morning arrived with the measured hush old houses prefer. I woke before the boiler remembered its job and lay still long enough to hear the clock in the hall decide 3 seconds in a row. My body held the shape of last night's work as if I'd been carrying a book pressed to my chest in my sleep. Downstairs, the air had that newly washed feeling it gets when a storm changes its mind at the edge of the bay. In the studio, the 1893 register waited as blotters cool under my fingers. I lifted the glass snake, eased the first leaf, and felt the paper accept its own stiffened edge. A page that has learned something doesn't forget it. You guide it where it will go and don't pretend otherwise. I mixed fresh paste, the wheat starch turning from translucent to milk smooth under the brush, and mended what I could reach tears first. Then the little phrase where a hand too quick had lifted what should have been slid. The room smelled of paste and linen and the quiet heat of work. When I looked up, a ribbon of sun lay across the floorboards, as if someone had unrolled it while I wasn't watching. Days arranged themselves without visitors. I reset the pantry to a logic that belonged to me, put the quilts back over the arm of the parlor sofa, and let the house answer to its own name. Tamsin brought over a tray of starts for the garden parsley, 2 hopeful foxgloves, a thyme that looked like it had ideas. We put them in the strip of earth by the steps and watered until the soil drank without argument. Later, I walked under the redwoods at Alder Grove, the kind of tall that makes a person remember how small is not the same thing as less. Wind moved higher than the eye can follow, and the trunks carried the sound downward like a private language. News traveled the way that always does in a town that still has a grocery bulletin board, small, accurate, without malice. Ruth had a new system for grocery lists, someone said color-coded and taped inside a cabinet door. Lionel liked to audit the household budget and cross-check the receipts. Caleb started staying late at the shop, which made the dog bark at the wrong hour. Nora was fine people said in the tone people use when they don't know whether fine means anything. One evening the phone rang. The number was familiar but unannounced. I answered because I always have. Breathing first. A thin thread, then a thicker one, then a sound I recognized from years I don't often visit. Mom, Nora said, and then did not say anything else. The line carried her without decor, just air and a human throat, and the scrape of someone remembering how to speak without guidance. "I'm here," I said. I said nothing more. I let the house do the rest, its steady heat, the hinge it had learned not to squeal the table that held the phone without wobbling. In that silence, something shaped itself and then stepped back. When the line went quiet, I set the receiver down the way you place a cup on a saucer you like. The room kept breathing. The days took on edges that fit. I worked longer at the bench and started the slow wash of a flood-swollen atlas that had waited for months. I ate at the kitchen table with both elbows on the wood and didn't apologize to anyone for the habit. The new keys lived in the bowl by the door and grew warm to the touch. At night, I slept like a person whose house had climbed back into its own body. On a bright, wind-tossed afternoon, I saw a figure at the far end of the walk, coat held closed at the throat hair blown across her cheek and pushed back again, not carrying anything. Nora stopped where the sidewalk lifts a fraction before the first step. I opened the door. Neither of us spoke. Her eyes were rimmed as if she'd been out in salt air too long. She looked past me into the hall, not quite trusting the space to be the same shape. The light behind her was the harsh kind that makes even good faces unforgiving. It fell on her and then around her as if deciding on jurisdiction. When she did speak, the words were small and unadorned. "I was wrong," she said. The sentence did not change the weather. It did make a place where air had been holding its breath. She tried again, more careful. "I let their language be my language. I let it say things I didn't check against my own life. I let it say you were temporary. I leaned against the jamb because it felt right to be supported by my own house while I answered inside it. This place is not a prize," I said. "It's work. It's mine. If you want to share it, there are terms." "Yes," she said, and I watched the word land. She did not flinch. I said them the way Avery had said the facts, plain enough to stand on their own feet. No outside keys. No accounts run through anyone else's household. No meeting held in the studio unless I am in the room and say the room agrees. No sentence in this house that erases me while using my plates. Nora nodded once as if taking dictation from something she already knew. "Yes," she said again. "I don't want to live anywhere that needs me to disappear to count as belonging." I reached into the pocket of my skirt and took out a single new brass key. The locksmith had stamped a small letter on the head when I asked. The metal carries marks gladly if you give it a purpose. The letter was G, not for my name, but for the street that keeps us Garrick. I set the key in her palm and kept my hand there a heartbeat longer than necessary so she could feel the weight settle. "This one opens the door," I said. "It also closes it if the terms don't hold." Her fingers curled around the key. I watched her throat work around the size of what she was swallowing. "I understand," she said. She stopped and corrected herself. "May I come in?" "You may," I said, and stepped back. The threshold noticed us. Thresholds do. The house adjusted to include another person with the slow, exact grace it prefers. Nora stood in the hall looking the way people look when they return to a place that stored their height for them on a wall somewhere. Her gaze found the banister and the worn stripe where hands had taught the varnish to shine. She touched it like she was reading a passage she'd once known by heart. We did not hurry. I showed her the studio with its order restored and the register resting under a lighter weight. She made no suggestions, offered no help, and did not apologize to the book. We stood together looking down at the mended corner. "Better now," she said without theatrics, and the child, she'd been stepped forward for a second, just long enough to touch the room and retreat. In the kitchen, she reached for a glass, and then stopped remembering the terms and what they meant. I took one down and filled it with water from the tap. She drank it all and set the glass exactly on the circle. The last glass had made a small precision that did not pretend to be an apology. We sat at the table. The roses were gone. A bowl of lemons took their place, bright, unsentimental faces. Nora looked at her hands as if she were testing whether they still belonged to her. I could see the places where she had learned to speak briskly and the places where the briskness had worn thin. When she looked up, the expression she wore was new, but the bones under it were familiar. "I can carry my own accounts," she said. "I can ask for structure without borrowing their walls." "Good," I said. It was a statement, not a grade. We let the afternoon spend itself in the ordinary way. I folded a dish towel and unfolded it again because folding and unfolding a towel is sometimes the right size of thing to do. Nora stood cross to the window and watched a gull steady itself against a gust. Behind her, the light caught the letter stamped into the key, where it lay on the table, and the metal made a small bright promise to no one in particular. When she left, she took only the key and the glass shape of her own breath. The door closed with the soft, certain sound I had come to recognize. The house held its pitch. I went back to the bench and wrote a line on the slip under the register's weight. Dry. Board reset. Ready to return. The handwriting looked like itself again. Outside, the bay wind made its steady practice, and the day moved along the edges of the rooms, as if being careful not to wake anything that had finally fallen asleep. I put the kettle on. Steam rose in a thin rope and unraveled above the stove. In the front room, the quilts were where I wanted them. The pantry jars were arranged the way a person who cooks for herself arranges them. The clock considered another second and agreed to it. I stood hands quiet, house quiet, and listened while the water thought its way to boil. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. If this story resonated with you or made you reflect, I'd love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to share them in the comments below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next story. I'll see you next time as we continue exploring more journeys and lessons together.